Hey, this is Scott Ridout, the president of Converge, and today I've got the privilege of being with Brent Eldridge, who is the pastor here at Arbor Road, our host for this week at Unleash. And Brent, thank you so much for being the host for us.
Love it.
The reason we're here, the reason we wanted to be here is because I know the story of this church, at least part of it, and I would love for you to kind of fill in some of the gaps for us. So I know you came here about 12 years ago, but just tell us a little bit of the history of the church,
Sure.
if you don't mind.
Well, this was First Baptist Church of Lakewood for a long time. It was planted in 1947. There was an evangelist who came, a church planter from the East Coast named Pastor McPherson. He was here for just maybe 5 years, and then our second pastor, Pastor Carlson, really kind of lifted this thing off because he had that evangelistic heart, wanted to reach out to people who didn't know the Lord, and through the 50s and 60s grew this thing into one of the biggest churches in the country at the time.
When you say big, how big are we talking about?
He probably got it upwards of, I would say, 2,500 people.
Yeah, see, that's unheard of.
Back then, that was incredible.
Yeah.
And then Pastor Jim Bohr, who was our third pastor, came in 1970. He was feeling the weight of how do you take something that's already big and make it bigger, but he almost doubled it and made it, about 4,000 people.
Wow. But that was its first heyday, and then it began to hit some challenges. And
I grew up here, so I remember those challenges. And my dad was on staff here for about 20 years as the music pastor. And in 1990, the church split. And it went from being this massively influential church of thousands of people to, over the course of 15, 20 years, diving into just a couple of hundred people. And I was up in the Bay Area at a church, and my friend Jeff Zabel, who's leading worship for us here, we were both at that church. We both grew up here, though, and we were in this beautiful church up there. I was the executive over youth and young adults. He was the worship and arts guy. And we were struck by the fact that this church had leading it people who grew up in that church, guys who were then at that point there for 25, 30, 40 years. And we were so excited about what God was doing up there, but every time there was like a high five moment, we would always think about the fact that we had a church like that in Long Beach that had just fallen on tough times. We had heard that they were looking at disbanding. And I wrote a letter to the pastor at the time, and I told him that we were happy where we were at. We weren't looking to switch, but we just had a heart for Long Beach, and we had heard the church was sort of in troubling moments and wondered what it would look like for us to come back and be a part of the leadership. And honestly, we read it together with our wives, we prayed over it and felt like it was just too presumptuous. It was in 2005. So I had it stamped and ready to rock, and we filed it. And we put it away for 2 years. And believe it or not, Brian Loritz, who's speaking on Friday, he was up with us, and we were telling Brian about the story, and he really busted my chops about it. And he is really the guy who sort of got in my face about what he said was, "You're in a great church here, good for you. You've made it, it's a cushy job, you guys are making, your money. God gave you a passion for your church. He gave you a vision for Long Beach, and you are still here?" And we just took it as a total slap in the face. Yeah. And I ended up calling the senior pastor, and the next weekend he was up in our backyard. And that's how I started the candidating process of coming here in 2008.
And it was about how big when you came?
Maybe 200, 300 people.
And today, what's a weekend service?
Weekend services, we have anywhere between, say, 1,000 and 1,500 people in here.
That's fantastic. There's so many churches in Converge that would have the same story as Lakewood, as Arbor Road would. Yeah. But they're looking for a certain type of leader, and so I look at you, Brent, and I think you would fit in our church planting group. But there's something in your head, something in your heart that's different than maybe a church planting person. What is that?
Well, I was a part of a couple of church plants early on, and I think what I learned in the process is that I'm not a church planter, and I had to kind of just there was a part of me that felt a little defeated over that, because isn't that the future of the church? And I think what really struck my heart's chord was the reality that Paul was meant to plant churches, and he did it very effectively. And then there was Apollos, who watered and toiled with the weeding and the turning of the dirt and all the other things. And I guess that God really just sort of revealed to me in those church planting days that I'm an Apollos. I'm a cultivator. And I'm going to really use the skills and gifts God's given to me best in the context of a church that already exists. And a church like this it wasn't lacking funding. It wasn't lacking property. It was lacking vision. It was lacking shepherding. And to be able to go back to my home church, to a church with legacy and history, and be a part of cultivating and building it back up, fired me up. And I talked to a couple of friends and I said, what would you guys think about moving back to Long Beach? And let's throw our lives into that church that lit us up for ministry. And gosh, man, it's just been so rewarding. I mean, I literally could go on all day of the joy of it.
I think we could. I think we talk all day about, because this is one of the issues in American churches. Church planting, we definitely do that in Converge. We start new churches, but we also strengthen existing churches. And there's so many places where church plants can't go because there are existing buildings, et cetera, that there's still a congregation there, but it needs to be renewed, revitalized. And so just in our last little conversation, what are the 2 or 3 things that you did to begin this journey to help your church move to the place where the older generation embraced a new vision and celebrated what God was doing in the next generation?
Well, part of that was becoming a historian and really understanding this church. And so that we weren't saying, well, it's a new day and it's a new church and you're going to have to get on board with what we're doing. We wanted to meet people where they were at. I wanted to be the biggest history buff of this church. I wanted to be able to stand toe to toe with anyone who wanted to talk about the good old days and the yesteryear, and really be able to have the conversation about staff, leadership, direction, vision, all of those things. So part of it was honoring, the reality that we are a historical church. I almost immediately set up a quarterly breakfast, and I invited to that breakfast all the former chairmen of the board. So if they were the former chairmen of the board, they were still alive, they were still in this church, I invited them to this breakfast. We still meet quarterly. And it is just a great spot for me to be able to share a vision, hear from them, talk about sticky moments that they walked through so that we're not doomed to repeat them. And those guys have become my advocates in essence. They're able to tell the generations that they're closely associated with, this guy knows us, this guy loves us, this guy wants all of us to be together. So part of it was grabbing the history and also surrounding myself with wise counsel. Then the other part of it was just really identifying that we are a multi-generational, multicultural church. And the way that we say it is we want to be a Thanksgiving table. We want everyone to be at the table. We don't want the other table. No one wants to be relegated to the other table, young or old or whatever. Let's figure out how we can be together. And so there's just been a lot of bridge building, peacemaking, common love, deference, humility. It gets demonstrated from our team. And I just feel like it trickles right out to our people.
The work that you're doing and so many of our pastors in Converge are doing right now in existing churches is absolutely essential. We need to start new churches, but we need to strengthen existing churches as well. And so for all of you guys out there who are taking on that work, the same thing that Brent and the team at Arbor Road are doing, just thank you for all that you do.
Yeah.